She was the kind of woman people looked through, not at. That was something Mabel Crowe had understood about herself for a long time. Not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the quiet, practical acceptance of someone who had learned to use invisibility like a tool. She was 29 years old, soft in every place the world told women they shouldn't be, with wide brown eyes behind thick-framed glasses and hair she never quite had time to do anything interesting with. She worked the books for Harlow Shipping and Logistics, a mid-size import company, with a beautiful glass-fronted office on the waterfront in Charleston, South Carolina. And she was very, very good at her job. She was also smart enough to know that Harlow Shipping and Logistics did not make its real money from shipping. You didn't need a forensic accounting degree to see it, though Mabel happened to have one. You just needed to pay attention. The manifests that never quite matched. The invoices billed to subsidiaries that dissolved 6 months after being created. The cash injections that arrived on irregular Wednesdays from a holding company, registered in Cyprus, that she was never, under any circumstances, supposed to look at too closely. She looked at it very closely. Not out of bravado. Not out of any hero's impulse to expose the truth. She looked because numbers were the only language that had never lied to her, and something about those particular numbers kept her up at night, picking at the edges of her mind like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. She made notes in a personal ledger she kept at home. She cross-referenced dates. She was methodical and she was careful, and she told herself it was just professional curiosity. She told herself that right up until the Tuesday morning she arrived at work 40 minutes early and found a man she didn't recognize sitting at her desk, going through her files. He was not one of the dock workers. He was too still for that, too composed. The kind of stillness that didn't come from calm but from discipline. He wore a grey suit that cost more than Mabel's monthly rent, and when he heard the door, he didn't flinch. He simply looked up. Mabel froze in the doorway with her tote bag over one shoulder and a coffee cup in each hand, because she always brought 2, one for herself and one for the receptionist, Darcy, who had a newborn at home and looked like she was held together with dry shampoo and determination. "Mrs. Crowe," the man said. "Not a question." "That's my desk," she said. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Sutter would like to see you." Gerald Sutter was her direct supervisor, a nervous, over-caffeinated man who smelled perpetually of mouthwash and never made direct eye contact. He was not the kind of man who sent grey-suited strangers to collect employees before 8 in the morning. Mabel set both coffees on the filing cabinet by the door. "I'll just put my bag down," she said very calmly, and she did. And while she did, she slipped her personal ledger out of the bottom of the tote and into the inner pocket of her coat, and then she followed the man down the hall. She never saw her desk again. What she saw instead was the inside of a black SUV, a stretch of highway moving past tinted windows, and eventually, a room she'd never been in before, a conference room on the 7th floor of a building she vaguely recognized as belonging to the Harlow Group's parent company, a name she'd seen on letterheads but never thought much about. There were 3 men waiting. Gerald Sutter was one of them, and he couldn't look at her, which told her everything. The second man was a lawyer. She could tell by the folder on the table in front of him and the practiced blankness of his expression. The third man was seated at the far end of the table, and he was the reason the other 2 kept shifting in their seats. Mabel had never seen Corvin Harlow in person. She'd seen photographs, of course. Financial press. Occasionally a society page. The kind of images that made it into articles about enterprise and legacy and the Harlow family's century-long presence in the Charleston business community. In photographs, he looked like what he was. A wealthy man in his early 40s who'd inherited an empire and expanded it. Dark hair gone silver at the temples, sharp jaw. The kind of face that belonged on the cover of something expensive. In person, he was something else entirely. He was watching her the way she watched a balance sheet, looking for the thing that didn't add up, the number slightly out of place. Not threatening exactly, just precise. Like she was a problem he hadn't yet decided how to solve. "Sit down, Miss Crow," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. Mabel sat. The lawyer opened his folder. He began talking about confidentiality agreements, about the sensitive nature of certain financial operations, about the importance of discretion in the context of ongoing regulatory reviews. He talked for several minutes, and Mabel listened carefully and understood, with absolute clarity, that what he was actually saying was, "We know what you've been looking at, and we want to know how much you know. And we would very much like you to sign something that prevents you from telling anyone." When the lawyer finished, Corvin Harlow had not moved. He was still watching her. "What do you want to ask me?" he said. Not to the lawyer. To her, Mabel considered. She thought about the ledger in her coat pocket. She thought about the 12 months of careful notes she'd made, the patterns she'd traced, the numbers that told a story about a shipping company that moved a great deal more than cargo. "The Cyprus account," she said. "It's structured to look like a passive investment vehicle, but the transaction timing correlates too consistently with the doc manifests to be coincidental. Someone built it that way on purpose." She paused. "That's not an accusation. I'm just noting what the numbers say." The silence in the room was very complete. Gerald Sutter made a small sound that might have been a whimper. Corvin Harlow said nothing for a long moment. Then, for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked, almost imperceptibly, like surprise. "You've been here 3 years," he said. 2 years, and 8 months, and you've worked this out on your own. "The numbers are the numbers," Mabel said. "I just read them." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, very quietly to the lawyer, "Leave us." The lawyer left. Gerald Sutter left so fast, he nearly took the door off its hinges. Mabel and Corvin Harlow sat across the length of a mahogany conference table, and he looked at her like she was still the unsolved problem, but now like it was a problem he was interested in. "You could have gone to the authorities," he said. "You didn't." "I didn't have enough," she said. "Not yet, but you were getting there." "I was being thorough." He almost smiled. She couldn't quite be sure. It was a very small thing, there and gone, but she thought he almost smiled. "I'm going to offer you a choice," he said. "You can walk out of here with a settlement, a non-disclosure agreement, and a reference that will get you a job anywhere in the country. Or," he stopped, she said, "or you come work for me directly. Not for Harlow Shipping, for me." Mabel thought about Darcy and her 2 coffees that were still sitting on the filing cabinet by the door, getting cold. "Doing what?" she asked. "The same thing you've been doing," he said. "Paying attention." She said yes. She wasn't entirely sure why. She told herself it was practical. The salary he named was more than she'd ever expected to earn. And the work itself, the real work, would be exactly what she was good at. She told herself it was pragmatic. She told herself a lot of things. In the weeks that followed, as she settled into a quiet office, on the 6th floor of a different building, one of 4 buildings in the greater Charleston area that belonged, directly or indirectly, to Corvin Harlow. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that she had looked at him across that long conference table and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. A kind of recognition, the way you sometimes read a very complicated equation and understand it not just intellectually but in your bones. She told herself that was absurd because it was. She was Mabel Crow, unremarkable, perpetually underdressed, chronically early to everything, the woman people looked through, and Corvin Harlow was, well, he was what he was. The Harlow Empire stretched across 6 states. He moved through rooms the way weather moved through a valley. She had watched him, in those first weeks, in the moments he didn't know she was watching, and she had begun to suspect that the coldness everyone described in him was not coldness at all, but something more like armor, and that he wore it so completely and so constantly that most people simply mistook it for his skin. She never said any of this out loud. She did her work. She was invisible. That was fine. It was, she told herself, exactly fine. The call came on a Thursday evening, late, when the building had mostly emptied out. Mabel was still at her desk. She was always still at her desk, cross-referencing a set of wire transfers that had arrived from an operation in Savannah that Corvin had asked her to audit quietly, without filing anything formal yet. She had her glasses pushed up into her hair, which meant she wasn't actually seeing very well, which meant she was running purely on instinct and the slightly blurry patterns of numbers on her screen. Her phone buzzed. Internal line. The number belonged to Corvin's personal assistant, a compact, efficient man named Archer, who communicated primarily in bullet points, and who had never, in the 4 months Mabel had worked there, called her after 6 p.m. She picked up. Mrs. Crow. Archer's voice was very controlled, the kind of controlled that meant something was wrong. Mr. Harlow needs to speak with you. Can you come up to the 9th floor? Now, she said. Now, he said. Please. She found her glasses, smoothed her skirt, navy blue, slightly wrinkled from a full day at her desk, and took the elevator up. The 9th floor was Corvin's floor. She'd been up here twice before, both times for brief, formal meetings about the scope of her work. The space was minimal in the way that only very expensive things were minimal. Clean lines, dark wood, the kind of quiet that felt like it had been deliberately constructed. Corvin was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the harbor. He was still in his work clothes, jacket off, sleeves pushed to the elbows, and when she came in he turned and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Someone inside this organization has been selling information," he said. "I've known for approximately 3 weeks that there was a leak. I've narrowed it down to 1 of 4 people. Tonight, someone tried to frame the leak on you." The room was very quiet. "On me," Mabel said. "There are documents," he said, "manufactured, designed to look like you've been passing information to a competitor. They were sent anonymously to 2 of my associates earlier this evening." His jaw was tight. "They're convincing to someone who doesn't know your work." "But you do," she said slowly. "I know your work," he said. "I know exactly what your work looks like, Miss Crow. Those documents are not your work." He paused. "Someone wants you removed from this building before you find what I've asked you to find." She thought about the Savannah transfers, the numbers she'd been staring at all evening that were, now that she was thinking about it in a new light, starting to form a very specific shape. "I think I know which account," she said. He looked at her sharply. "The Savannah transfers," she said. "There's a routing anomaly. I was going to bring it to you tomorrow, but give me 20 minutes with the files, and I can show you exactly where the money is going and whose authorization is on it." He was very still. "You found it," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Almost," she said. "Almost." She never got the 20 minutes. She was on her way back to the elevator to collect her laptop when the doors opened and 2 men stepped out. She didn't know them. She had never seen them before, but she knew, in the particular way that people who have spent years paying very close attention know things, that they were not men who worked in this building. She turned to go back toward Corvin's office, and a hand closed around her arm so hard she felt it in her shoulder. She fought. She was not a large woman in the ways that the world considered useful for fighting. She was soft, and she was round, and she had never thrown a punch in her life. But she was also unexpected, and she used her elbow in a way that connected with something satisfying, and she managed one full scream before something dark came over her vision, and then there was nothing. She came back to consciousness in increments, like a radio tuning through static. Pain was first. Her wrists were bound behind her, and the chair was hard beneath her. And there was something sharp and specific across her left cheekbone that told her she'd been hit at some point. though she didn't remember it. Her glasses were gone. Everything beyond arm's reach was blur. She was in a warehouse. She could tell by the ceiling. High, industrial, the kind of bare-bones space that existed on every working waterfront. The smell was salt and rust, and something chemical underneath. Through the blurred, enormous windows, she could see the faint glitter of harbor water. There were 3 men in the room with her that she could make out, shapes at the edges of her limited vision. One was on the phone, one was seated. One was watching her with the particular quality of attention she associated with men who were being paid to watch. She breathed. She thought about the numbers. She thought about the routing anomaly in the Savannah transfers and the authorization signature. She'd been 2 steps from identifying when the elevator opened. She made herself think about the numbers, because numbers were what she knew, and knowing something, anything, was the only thing standing between her and the very specific kind of panic that would not help her at all right now. She heard the man on the phone say, "She doesn't know anything useful. We can deal with her and send Harlow the message directly." She heard her own heartbeat very clearly after that. Then she heard something else, a sound like a door coming off its hinges. She couldn't see it. She could only hear it, raised voices, then a crack of sound that her brain took a moment to identify, then another, and then the particular quality of silence that follows violence, dense, ringing, absolute. Then footsteps, measured, not running, the footsteps of someone who had already done what needed doing and was no longer in a hurry. A shape moved through her blur and crouched in front of her, and she felt hands, careful, deliberate, at her wrists, working at the binding. Her glasses appeared. Someone placed them on her face with a precision that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. Corvin Harlow came into focus. He was not composed the way she was used to seeing him composed. The jacket was gone. There was blood on his shirt that she was fairly certain was not his. His eyes moved over her face with an intensity that she had never seen there before. And she had watched him carefully. She had made a study of this man in the way she made a study of everything, and she had never seen this. His hand came up. His thumb brushed very gently along her cheekbone, just below where the pain was sharpest, and his jaw went rigid in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with fury being carefully, deliberately held back. "How bad?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "I'm okay," she said. Mabel. It was the first time he had ever used her name. The first time in 4 months, and it landed somewhere in her chest like a key in a lock she hadn't known was there. How bad? She swallowed. My cheek, my wrists. "I'm okay, Corvin. She stopped. She hadn't meant to use his name. She didn't know if people used his name. She started to apologize, and he shook his head very slightly, and then he said something that stopped every thought she had. "I know what I said. I told you it was a professional arrangement. I told myself the same thing." His voice was low and careful, like he was placing each word down deliberately. "That was a lie I was comfortable with until approximately 40 minutes ago, when Archer told me you were gone, and I understood what that meant, and He stopped. His hand was still at her cheek, barely there. "I'm not comfortable with it anymore." The warehouse was very still around them. Mabel looked at him. She was aware that she was in a warehouse with 2 men zip-tied on the floor behind him and blood on his shirt, and her face felt like someone had tried to rearrange it, and she thought, this is an objectively terrible moment to be having this conversation. She thought, he cannot mean what this sounds like, she thought. I have been invisible my whole life, and I am very good at misreading rooms. You should know something, she said carefully. I misread things sometimes. Numbers I'm good at, but people. You're not misreading this, he said. She breathed. I found the account, she said, because it was what she knew how to do, because it was solid ground. Before they grabbed me, the authorization signature on the Savannah transfer. It's Leland, your operations director. Something moved through his expression that was not surprise. Leland, he said. Third transfer from the left, the one routed through the Memphis subsidiary. The signature block is in a slightly different font than the others. Whoever faked it used an old template. I don't know if it was him or if someone used his credentials, but that's where you start. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, Even now what? You're doing your job. And there it was again. That thing she'd seen once before across a conference table. There and gone. Too small and too real to be anything other than genuine. Even right now, in this warehouse, you are doing your job. Someone has to, she said. And then, because the adrenaline was wearing off, and her cheek hurt and her wrists ached, and she was exhausted all the way down to her bones. I'd like to go home now. Yes, he said. You're going home. He helped her up from the chair, and she stood, and she was steadier than she expected to be. And he kept a hand at her elbow the whole way out, through the side door of the warehouse, and into the night air off the harbor, where 2 cars were waiting. She stopped just outside the door and tipped her head back and breathed the salt air and thought about how, for 2 years and 8 months at Harlow Shipping, she had walked into that glass-fronted building every morning and made herself small and careful and easy to overlook, and none of it had mattered in the end. She'd been seen anyway, first by the wrong people and then, apparently, by the right one. Leland was arrested 3 weeks later, though the mechanism of that arrest was not entirely through official channels. And Mabel had learned enough by then not to ask about the part she hadn't been directly involved in. She had been directly involved in a great deal of it. The evidence she built from the Savannah transfer was meticulous and complete and cross-referenced in 4 different directions. And when she presented it to Corvin, in the quiet of his 9th floor office, it took him 10 minutes to look through it and another 30 seconds to make 2 phone calls. Then he set the folder down on the desk and looked at her across the length of it, and she looked back at him, and she thought about all the ways she had made herself invisible over the years. The shapeless sweaters, the sensible shoes, the careful habit of taking up as little space as possible, in a world that had consistently made it clear that women who looked like her were expected to be grateful for what room they were allowed. She thought about the way he had said her name in the warehouse, the way his thumb had moved across her cheek. I want to say something, she said, and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong, because I would rather be wrong and know it than spend the next however long wondering. He waited. That was one of the things about him. He was very good at waiting. I think you see me, she said. Not the job I do. Me, and I don't have a lot of experience with that, and I don't entirely trust it, and I need you to know that. Not as a warning, just as a fact. Because facts are what I deal in. He was quiet for a moment. I've watched you walk into this building every day for 4 months, he said. I know you bring 2 coffees in the morning and keep one on your desk until it's cold because you forget to drink it. I know you have a habit of pushing your glasses up into your hair when you're working through something complicated, which means when I see you without your glasses, I know you're close to an answer. I know you stay later than anyone else on this floor, not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because the work matters to you. He paused. I know you think you're invisible. I need you to understand that you have never been invisible to me. Mabel Crow, who had kept her own counsel through a great deal, who had made a professional habit of steadiness, felt something come apart in her chest in the best possible way, the way a complicated equation sometimes resolves itself into something suddenly, perfectly simple. Okay, she said. Her voice was only slightly unsteady. Okay, he said, and the small thing that was almost a smile, the one she'd catalogued only twice before, in 4 months of careful observation, appeared, and this time it didn't disappear. She kept the ledger. The personal one, from the beginning, the handwritten notes she'd been making since month 2 at Harlow Shipping, every anomaly she'd noticed, every number slightly out of place. She kept it in the drawer of her new desk, on the 9th floor, in the office adjacent to his that she'd moved into without either of them formally discussing it. The way some things simply settled themselves into being true. Darcy from reception had gotten a raise and 3 months of paid parental leave, which Mabel had suggested in a memo that Corvin had approved without comment, and which she chose to take as a meaningful data point. She came in early. She brought 2 coffees. She pushed her glasses up into her hair when she was close to an answer. And sometimes she looked up and found him watching her from the doorway of his office, with an expression she was still learning to read. Not because it was complicated, but because she was still, in some deep and well-worn groove of herself, surprised that it was there at all. She was getting better at being surprised. She was Mabel Crow. She was 29 years old, and she was soft in all the ways the world had once told her not to be, and she was the best accountant Corvin Harlow had ever employed. And she was seen, entirely, precisely, without qualification, by the most dangerous man in 6 states. She had looked at the numbers for a long time. They had finally come out even.